On 1982, the skies over Lebanon were supposed to be the proving ground for Soviet air doctrine. Instead, they became its graveyard. On a blistering June morning, Israeli F-15 Eagles took to the air under the cover of early sunlight. Their target, Syrian MiG squadrons, flooding into the Bekaa Valley, reinforced by years of Soviet training hardware and doctrine. On paper, the battle should have been close, even, fair. It wasn't. Within minutes, chaos erupted across the radar screens. Syrian MiG-21s scrambled and climbed fast, their ground controllers shouting vectors through static. But something was wrong. The enemies they were sent to intercept were never seen. The MiGs would bank and turn, but their radars showed nothing. No lock, no blip, just silence. Then came the first explosion. An F-15 fired an AIM-7 Sparrow at 40 miles out. One MiG vanished from the sky before its pilot even knew he was targeted. Another tried to loop back, but a second missile found him mid-turn. Within 6 minutes, 5 MiGs were gone. Not a single Eagle had been touched. Inside Syrian command bunkers, panic spread. Soviet advisors watched in disbelief. These weren't rookies in outdated planes. They were flying modern MiG-23s and MiG-21BI's variants, hand-delivered by Moscow. They had every advantage Soviet doctrine offered: numerical superiority, ground, radar guidance, coordinated tactics. And it made no difference. By the end of the day, 14 MiGs had been destroyed. The F-15s had taken no losses. In one room, a Soviet air marshal stood frozen, staring at the engagement readout. His voice, dry and hoarse, cut through the tension. How do you fight an enemy you can't see? The battle hadn't just gone wrong, it had shattered assumptions. The Eagle wasn't supposed to be that good. Not against trained pilots. Not against real Soviet airframes. But somehow it was. That was the moment Soviet planners realized they weren't dealing with just another American fighter. They were dealing with something that broke the rules. And it had just begun. For decades, Soviet air doctrine had rested on a powerful conviction: overwhelming numbers, rugged airframes, and centralized control could outmatch anything the West produced. The MiG was the proof. Whether it was the agile MiG-21 or the high-speed MiG-23, these aircraft were symbols of socialist efficiency, affordable, easily produced, and lethal in swarms. In briefings across Warsaw, packed, Air Academy's instructors emphasized a central mantra: air superiority is achieved not by individual aircraft, but by massed formations and ground-directed control. Victory came from numbers, timing, and obedience. American jets, by contrast, were painted as fragile luxuries, too complex, too expensive, too dependent on pilot skill. The F-15 Eagle, first spotted in the 1970s, was mocked in Soviet reports as overweight and theoretical, a paper plane that might impress at an air show but couldn't survive real combat. Analysts cited its cost up to 4 times more than a MiG-21 and questioned its utility. Could one plane, no matter how advanced, survive being outnumbered 10-1? The Soviet answer was no. Their own calculations showed that MiG squadrons operating in tight formations with a real-time support from ground radar would detect, track, and overwhelm any Western fighter that dared enter contested airspace. But this analysis overlooked something fundamental. The West was changing its game. While Soviet pilots trained for knife fight dogfights at close range, American doctrine evolved around BVR, beyond visual range combat. The F-15 was not built to turn with MiGs at low altitude. It was built to destroy them before they ever knew it was there. Equipped with the revolutionary AN/APG-63 radar and the AIM-7 Sparrow, the F-15 turned every engagement into a sniper shot from miles away. But the Soviet mindset didn't bend. They believed the F-15 needed AWACS to function. They believed it was only effective against inferior opponents. They believed above all that Soviet-trained pilots in Soviet-built jets could break it. They believed until the bodies of MiG pilots began falling from the sky. And when those bodies started stacking up in Lebanon, in Iraq and Libya, the myth began to crack. But instead of adapting, Soviet command doubled down. Their mistake wasn't in the MiG. It was in the mindset behind it. In the Soviet view of air combat, war in the sky was an extension of war on the ground, tightly organized, centrally commanded, and brutally efficient. Pilots were not lone hunters, they were pawns in a larger machine. From the moment they took off, every move was dictated by ground controllers, feeding them vectors, altitudes, and priorities. This system had worked before. In Korea and Vietnam, even in early border conflicts, Soviet-trained MiG pilots had used this method to score kills against more advanced Western aircraft. The key was discipline, tight formations, rigid communications, and overwhelming numbers. The doctrine emphasized simplicity, short-range IR missiles, fast jets, and rapid climb-outs. Dogfighting, though minimized in theory, remained central in practice. Soviet jets like the MiG-21 and MiG-23 were designed to engage in the visual arena, not to outthink an enemy 50 miles away. Radar was merely a tool for guidance, not the decisive instrument of war. Meanwhile, the Americans were quietly rewriting every line of that playbook. From the mid-1970s, the U.S. Air Force invested in air superiority as a holistic system. The F-15 wasn't just a fighter, it was a flying command post, capable of detecting, tracking, and destroying targets before its pilot ever laid eyes on them. It was a product of the no-compromise design philosophy: twin engines, massive thrust, pulse Doppler radar, and a bubble canopy giving the pilot godlike situational awareness. But more important than the hardware was the freedom it gave. F-15 pilots were trained not just to fly, but to think, to improvise, to exploit weaknesses in radar patterns, timing, and terrain. The fighter's radar could track multiple targets across varied altitudes, lock on while maneuvering, and discriminate between friends and foes in a crowded sky. In short, the Eagle could do everything the MiG was never designed to counter. Yet Soviet doctrine assumed the opposite: that the Americans would play by the same rules, that radar control and mass formation would force the enemy into predictable patterns. But when F-15s began engaging from 50 miles out, then turning away before MiGs could retaliate, those assumptions collapsed. Even worse, the MiG pilots didn't know why they were losing. To Soviet strategists, it wasn't a matter of tactics. It was a matter of paradigm, and they were operating under one that was about to die. The first undeniable crack in Soviet air superiority didn't occur in the skies over the USSR. It happened in the Middle East, in a narrow corridor known as the Bekaa Valley, June 9, 1982. Operation Mole Cricket 19, Israel had deployed a mixed force of F-15 Eagles and F-16s in a daring attempt to decapitate Syria's Soviet-backed air defense grid. The plan wasn't just to win a battle, it was to test a system. And the F-15 was at the center of it. At 9:40 a.m., Syrian early warning radars picked up faint returns. Jets were moving fast, high, and wide, too fast for the MiG-21s on patrol to intercept. Ground controllers scrambled every available fighter. 24 MiG-21s took off, joined minutes later by MiG-23s and MiG-25s. Soviet advisors in Damascus nodded in approval. This was the moment they'd trained for. But the F-15s never entered the trap. Instead, they circled outside the kill box, listening, watching, waiting. Then they struck. From over 40 miles away, the Eagles locked on. AIM-7 Sparrows flew silent and straight. The first 4 MiGs were gone before Syrian pilots even knew they were in a fight. Those who tried to turn and burn found their radar screens empty and their 6 o'clock lit up with heat seekers from F-16s closing from below. By noon, 23rd Syrian aircraft had been shot down. Not one F-15 had taken a hit. In control rooms across the Middle East, Soviet advisors stared in silence. One senior officer reportedly whispered, "They never even saw them." Another muttered, "This isn't a battle, it's a harvest." It was more than a defeat. It was the first time a Soviet-aligned air force had followed every doctrinal step. Scramble early, vector efficiently engage in force, and been obliterated without scoring a single kill. And the most terrifying part, there was no malfunction, no weather disruption, no overwhelming numerical disadvantage. Just F-15s doing exactly what they were designed to do, dominate the sky with absolute impunity. For the Soviet Union, it was the first time they saw a weapons system trained, tested, and executed, entirely outside their doctrine, completely dismantle their expectations. It wasn't luck. It wasn't an anomaly. It was a glimpse into a future they weren't ready for. The reports from Syria arrived thick with detail and Soviet disbelief. 23 aircraft lost, no enemy casualties. Entire radar stations jammed. MiG-21s and MiG-23s defeated without ever achieving lock. These weren't rumors, they were data. Hard digital, undeniable. But in Moscow, denial reigned. The initial reaction within the Ministry of Defense was suspicion. Perhaps the Syrians had lied. Perhaps Israeli claims were exaggerated. Perhaps pilots had panicked and fled before combat. High Command refused to accept that Western fighters, especially American-built F-15s, had so thoroughly outmatched their frontline aircraft. Some officers blamed Syrian incompetence. Poor discipline, they muttered. Lack of training. Lack of. Others pointed to maintenance errors or failure to adhere strictly to command guidance. Still others accused the Israeli Air Force of manipulating video feeds and radar records. But deep in the corridors of Soviet air intelligence, unease grew. When satellite imagery confirmed the wreckage of dozens of MiGs in Bekaa Valley, denials lost power. Engineers reviewing telemetry from radar stations realized the problem wasn't jamming alone. The F-15s had evaded detection entirely in several phases of the battle, hitting from above, below, and beyond the MiG's response windows. It wasn't just a weapons mismatch. It was a doctrinal failure. Yet admitting that would mean confronting sacred truths of the Soviet system. That a highly centralized air force with numerically superior, if aging, aircraft could be outthought, outflown, and outfought by a smaller force of autonomous pilots. That Western avionics and radar had quietly leapt ahead of Soviet capabilities. Unacceptable. So the official line remained firm. Syrian command bungled the engagement. The Israelis exploited terrain weather and unfair technical advantages. And the Eagle. It was still just a fast, expensive jet, effective only because it fought inferior enemies. Still, in private briefings, the tone shifted. Senior generals began asking hard questions. What if the Americans could replicate this? What if NATO had trained every F-15 pilot to do this, not just the Israelis? What if MiGs couldn't win not because of pilot error, but because they were simply obsolete? That was a truth the Soviet Union wasn't ready to say out loud. Not yet. When the Kremlin finally moved to explain the catastrophic performance of MiG squadrons against F-15s, they didn't blame technology or doctrine. They blamed tactics. Specifically, they clung to one deeply flawed theory that the Americans had simply caught the Syrians by surprise. According to this logic, the Israelis had used deception, low radar, cross-section profiles, terrain masking, electronic jamming to sneak into range and unleash their volleys before the Syrian air defense network could fully activate. It wasn't the F-15's capability that had won the day, Moscow insisted it was an ambush. The solution, better radar coverage, more overlapping SAM sites, closer coordination between ground control and fighter patrols. But this interpretation missed the point entirely. The F-15 didn't win because it snuck in. It won because it didn't have to. This was a machine that could see targets 100 kilometers away and destroy them before the enemy even knew they were being tracked. Its radar, the AN/APG-63, was one of the first to use pulse Doppler technology, meaning it could filter out clutter from terrain and track targets flying low-fast or evasively. And when paired with the AIM-7 Sparrow missile, the Eagle didn't need to fly into a fight. It simply erased it from afar. The ambush theory also ignored how F-15s maintained kill dominance across every theater, from the Middle East to the Persian Gulf, from red flag exercises to NATO's northern flank. MiGs weren't being surprised, they were being systematically outclassed. But the Soviet Air Force, still rooted in the belief that war was won through numbers and coordination, couldn't see the shift. Their manuals still taught pilots to close the distance, to rely on ground radar, to fire only when visual confirmation was achieved. The idea of autonomous air combat at 40 miles away was still viewed as American fantasy. And so, the real problem was ignored. The Eagle didn't just outperform the MiG, it invalidated it. But by treating each defeat as an isolated anomaly, Soviet command protected its pride and sealed its fate. In classrooms across the USSR, young pilots were still being trained to fight wars that had already been lost in the sky. Because the true revolution wasn't stealth missiles or even radar. It was the freedom to act without permission. And the F-15 had been designed to do just that long before the Soviets knew what hit them. As Soviet analysts scrambled to make sense of the repeated failures, a new explanation emerged, one meant to soothe command nerves and deflect from deeper flaws. The narrative shifted from surprise attack to technology overreach. The F-15, they claimed, was simply too complex to be sustainable. Their new theory was seductive, that the Americans had built an overly intricate system, an aircraft reliant on expensive components, vulnerable to maintenance delays, and so sophisticated it could only function under perfect conditions. It couldn't possibly hold up in prolonged war. This belief was comforting to Soviet planners who had long prioritized simplicity and quantity. Their jets were designed for wartime attrition, fast to produce, fast to fix, and fast to replace. They argued that in a drawn-out conflict, the F-15 would be grounded by logistics while MiGs would keep flying. But there was a problem. The theory collapsed in reality. In NATO exercises, F-15s posted record sortie rates, often flying multiple missions per day with minimal maintenance delays. Its engines, the Pratt & Whitney F-100s, were built for both thrust and durability. The radar systems, though advanced, proved more reliable than their Soviet counterparts, and its digital fire control allowed pilots to track and engage targets far faster than any MiG system could manage. Even worse for the Soviets, the Eagle was designed with modular redundancy. If one system failed, another took over. In combat scenarios from the Gulf of Sidra to the Iran-Iraq War, F-15s operated in hostile, sandy, high-temperature conditions and returned home mission after mission without mechanical failure. The idea of American fragility was a myth, and Soviet command had believed it because it fit their worldview. The MiG wasn't supposed to win by being better. It was supposed to win by being good enough, long enough. But the F-15 didn't need numbers. It didn't need redundancy in squadrons. It was built to survive, dominate, and return. This theory, like the one before, it ignored the human element. F-15 pilots were trained to think independently, execute without micromanagement, and adapt in real time. No Soviet MiG pilot had that luxury. Even in the most chaotic engagements, American pilots were free to break formation, exploit weaknesses, and chase kills with full confidence in their machines. In the Soviet view, war was a numbers game. The F-15 proved that one aircraft in the hands of the right pilot could rewrite that equation. And while Moscow was still counting missiles, the Eagle was counting kills. Soviet military intelligence had spent years monitoring the development of the F-15 Eagle. They had diagrams, intercepted telemetry radar profiles, and even spy satellite images of U.S. air bases where the sleek twin-tail fighter trained daily. But none of that mattered because they failed to understand one thing: what the Eagle was built to do. From their perspective, the F-15 was just another iteration of American Excess, a heavier, faster, more expensive fighter, meant to impress Congress and intimidate allies. They underestimated its agility, overestimated its complexity, and most fatally misunderstood the doctrine behind it. When reports from the Middle East began filtering in showing MiGs shot down without a single visual engagement, Soviet analysts were caught off guard. Their models predicted even engagements, maybe even slight Soviet advantages in close quarters. But the data told another story. Kill ratios were reaching absurd levels: 10-0, 15-0. By the mid-1980s, the running tally stood at 58-0 in favor of the F-15. Still, internal memos dismissed the numbers. Western exaggeration, one report read. Probable over-reporting by U.S. pilots. The problem wasn't just arrogance, it was cultural. Soviet intelligence operated under intense pressure to deliver findings that aligned with party ideology. Suggesting that a U.S. fighter could decisively outmatch Soviet jets was politically dangerous. So assessments were softened, doubts were buried, and crucial opportunities to adapt were missed. Even when they did attempt to adjust their countermeasures were misaligned. They developed faster MiG variants like the MiG-29, but failed to integrate the long-range radar and BVR capabilities that made the F-15 so lethal. They upgraded SAM systems, but failed to train their crews to operate under the kind of ECM electronic countermeasures the Eagle routinely employed. In essence, Soviet intelligence mistook data for understanding. They knew the Eagle's specs. They just didn't know what they meant. They couldn't see that the F-15's greatest weapon wasn't its radar or missiles. It was doctrinal autonomy. Every pilot was a strategist, every radar ping was a potential kill, and every engagement was engineered to be over before it began. By the time they realized this, it was too late. The Eagle wasn't just a platform, it was a philosophy. One that Soviet intelligence couldn't decode because they were looking through the wrong lens. And as more MiGs burned across the skies of Lebanon, Iraq, and the Persian Gulf, the red warning lights on their assumptions began blinking furiously. But Moscow still refused to see the truth flashing right in front of them. The real power of the F-15 Eagle wasn't in its airframe, its radar, or even its missiles. It was in the invisible architecture wrapped around it. The system that had produced it refined it and trusted it. That system began not in the skies, but in a room, a set of post-Vietnam planning meetings at the Pentagon. In the wake of America's tactical and strategic confusion during that war, one truth had become clear: air superiority couldn't be reactive anymore. It had to be engineered into every engagement. The U.S. wouldn't fight fair. It would fight to win instantly. Thus, the Eagle was born under a radical design principle, not a pound for air-to-ground. This would be the first jet in history designed purely to own the sky. Every component, from the AN/APG-63 radar to the twin F-100 engines, was selected for one purpose: to detect, engage, and destroy enemy aircraft before they could fight back. But the jet was only half the story. The other half was the man behind the stick. American pilots were no longer trained as cogs in a machine. They were trained as independent decision-makers. Red flag exercises at Nellis Air Force Base turned them into hunters. They flew mock battles against aggressor squadrons equipped with MiG-style tactics, painted in Soviet colors, and designed to simulate the harshest possible scenarios. By the time an F-15 pilot deployed, he wasn't learning how to fly. He was learning how to outthink an enemy who had never flown alone in his life. And the system around them didn't stop at the cockpit. AWACS planes fed them early warning data. Satellite uplinks relayed real-time information. Electronic warfare pods jammed enemy radars. Tankers kept them fueled, while command networks allowed them to operate with a degree of independence that no Soviet pilot ever experienced. It was decentralization, not chaos, but freedom. Freedom to engage, freedom to disengage, freedom to adapt. This was America's hidden weapon, a trust-based war machine, a belief that a well-trained pilot, given the right tools and clear intent, could do more damage than 100 top-down commands. Meanwhile, the Soviet pilot operated under limits. He needed permission to climb to fire, to even break formation. His radar was less capable. His missiles lacked reliability. And worst of all, his commanders didn't believe he could win without micromanagement. That belief, more than anything else, sealed the MiG's fate. So when F-15s began stacking kills at a ratio of 104 to 0, it wasn't an anomaly. It was a manifestation of everything the American system had quietly evolved into. An Eagle wasn't just a plane. It was the sharp end of a doctrine the Soviets didn't believe was possible until it started erasing their aircraft from the sky. The final humiliation didn't come in Europe. It came in the desert over the burning sands of the Persian Gulf during Operation Desert Storm, 1991. Iraq had one of the most modernized, Soviet-aligned air forces in the world. Dozens of MiG-29s, MiG-25s, and MiG-23s were deployed across hardened air bases, backed by an extensive SAM network and a radar coverage built by Soviet engineers. Baghdad was wrapped in what Soviet planners called a layered air shield. And yet in just the first 100 hours, the U.S. Air Force destroyed that shield from above with F-15s leading the charge. The numbers were brutal. 33 aerial victories were scored by F-15s. 0 losses. Every Iraqi fighter that tried to engage was gunned down, usually before the pilot even saw his attacker. MiG-25s attempted high-speed escapes. MiG-29s tried tight turns and missile salvos. But none of it mattered. The F-15s simply saw them first locked on first and fired first. The most infamous moment came on January 19th when 2 Iraqi MiG-29s launched to intercept incoming strike aircraft. Within minutes, both were destroyed by F-15Cs operating under total radar control. One was killed by an AIM-7 Sparrow. The other, in a moment that became legend, was shot down as it tried to flee to Iran, chased down and eliminated mid-escape. Back in Moscow, the silence was deafening. This wasn't Vietnam. This wasn't Lebanon. This was the most fortified Soviet-modeled air defense network ever built, and it was collapsing in days. Soviet advisors, who had once boasted of layered engagement zones and overlapping fire patterns, were now watching their doctrines fail, broadcast live on CNN. American F-15s weren't just winning battles. They were rewriting air warfare on the fly. They entered contested airspace solo. They broke formation at will. They communicated directly with AWACS and responded to threats independently. Soviet-trained Iraqi pilots conditioned to follow centralized command couldn't adapt. By the time their orders were given, they were already dead. One Soviet general watching footage of a kill confirmed by HUD cam reportedly muttered, "This isn't war. This is a technology demonstration." But it wasn't the tech that was humiliating, it was the implication. The F-15, long dismissed as an overpriced Western toy, had just wiped out the core of the Soviet export air force in days. It had proven immune to radar traps, blind jamming, and surgical in its strikes. And in doing so, it destroyed more than aircraft. It shattered the myth of parity. It proved that the sky wasn't contested. It was owned. By 1991, the Soviet Union was crumbling under its own weight. But among the many reasons for its collapse, one often overlooked, is this: it no longer believed it could win the next war. Desert Storm had laid that bare, not in vague forecasts or think tank papers, but in live footage, intercepted signals, and the burning wreckage of Soviet-designed jets across the desert. The MiG-29 had failed. The layered SAM defenses had failed. The doctrine of tightly controlled air operations had failed. The F-15 hadn't just achieved a 104-0 kill ratio. It had destroyed the credibility of Soviet air power. For decades, the USSR had invested in quantity over quality, assuming its sheer industrial mass could outlast and outgun any Western advance. But now that theory was dead. One American pilot in one F-15 had the power to erase a squadron of MiGs, and he didn't need permission from command to do it. What Soviet command didn't anticipate was the psychological detonation that would follow. Within Warsaw-packed militaries, whispers grew. If the Iraqis lost that badly, what chance would we have? Training morale dipped. Strategic planners, reviewing decades of force posture assumptions, began seeing F-15-shaped holes in every model. In Poland, East Germany, and even inside Soviet air academies, officers began to quietly revise their assumptions about NATO's capabilities. The implications rippled up to the top. How could the Soviet Union continue to assert strategic parity with a nation that had rendered its entire export air fleet obsolete? How could they credibly deter NATO when American aircraft could penetrate, dominate, and destroy without resistance? And this wasn't just about planes. It was about ideological failure. The F-15 wasn't the product of command economy planning. It wasn't built under 5-year quotas or political oversight. It emerged from a system that rewarded innovation, trusted autonomy, and trained its warriors to act, not wait. In the Soviet system, initiative was a risk. In the American system, it was a requirement. So when the final kill was tallied, not just in the Gulf, but across a decade of silent skirmishes, the truth was undeniable. The Eagle had soared not just over enemy airfields, but over the wreckage of a failing worldview. Today, the F-15 still flies. It's been nearly half a century since it first took to the skies, but the Eagle remains a dominant force, modernized, rearmed, and still undefeated in air-to-air combat. Newer fighters have entered service. Stealth aircraft like the F-22 and F-35 have taken center stage. But the F-15, with its unmistakable twin-tail silhouette, continues to patrol skies around the world. And in many parts of the former Soviet Union, it still haunts the imagination. In Russia, air defense has evolved. New radar arrays, more advanced SAM systems, hypersonic programs. Yet buried deep in the doctrine is a lingering fear, the memory of being blind. Blind to the F-15's range, blind to its radar locks, blind to the doctrine that allowed it to operate like a ghost in contested airspace. It wasn't just about being outgunned. It was about being outthought. Former Soviet pilots, now retired or serving in modern Russian command structures, speak in quiet tones about the Eagle's reign. Some respect it. Others resent it. But none forget it. And while the Cold War may be over, its ghosts still fly. Every time a NATO drill launches F-15s from Alaska, Germany, or Qatar radar crews in Kaliningrad and Murmansk track them with unease, every time a simulated engagement pits MiG variants against Eagles in war games, the old numbers creep back in kills without losses. Engagements ended before they began. Because the Eagle was never just a jet, it was the moment the Soviet Union realized that air dominance wasn't just about power, it was about freedom. The freedom to see first, shoot first, and act without waiting. A freedom their system could never replicate. In museums across Russia, old MiGs stand preserved in concrete plazas, static, silent, and still painted in the gray and red of an empire that no longer exists. But the F-15, it's still flying, still lethal, still undefeated, and still whispering across every radar screen it crosses. The Cold War never really ended, it just changed altitude.